5 major covenants. Each one of those covenants has a body of literature, history, music, art, poetry that surrounds that covenant. So the scripture, the Bible, is made up of 5 major covenants and 5 major canons that surround them. I'll give you an example. So the first one of Noah's covenant with God, you find Noah's covenant with God in Genesis chapter 7, 8, and 9. You find the whole story of the flood and all of that, and he makes covenant with God after the flood. And so you find that story. And yet, if you were to look at chapter 1 of Genesis through chapter 11, that's the canon. The covenant appears in chapters 7, 8, and 9. But to understand the full body of the story, the canon of the story, it actually starts back in Genesis 1. So if you're going to explain to somebody Noah's flood and the story of Noah's covenant with God, you have to start the story with in the beginning. And you start to explain how wonderful it was and how much God loved them and how he was reaching out to them to have relationship and how they turned away and how they chose to go their own way. And the fall and how they get kicked out of the garden. And you go through Cain and Abel and you start to follow down this story until man becomes so evil and horrendous that it makes God furious. No, actually that's not the story. It grieves God's heart so bad. Because he's the father who wanted relationship the whole time and was trying to have relationship with them in the garden, and they've wandered so far that every inclination of man's heart was after wickedness, except for Noah and his family. And so he hits the reset button, essentially, and he starts over, and he has a covenant with Noah, and his family essentially is represented in that. So you have a covenant between God and Noah. But to make sense of the Noah covenant, you have to back up and start the story at the beginning. So it starts back there, and you get up to chapter 7, 8, and 9, and the covenant now makes sense inside of its canon. The second one, I'm not going to run through all these, but I think it'll help you see the picture that the canon that surrounds the Abrahamic covenant is Genesis chapter 12 to chapter 50. That's the canon that surrounds the second covenant. The canon there, it starts with a man named Abram who lives in a land of Ur, of the Chaldees, and God begins to speak to him and call him out. And then he finally leaves and he obeys and he starts to walk, and God begins to give him promises. And then he has an encounter with God where God makes covenant. But you don't just immediately start with the covenant. You start back here with Abram and you walk through his story. And then you get to see, okay, God made covenant with him. Now, how did that covenant journey go? And so you get to read about his sons and how that story began to play out, and how God is working and protecting and guiding and working with his covenant partner and a bloodline that comes from Abraham. So the canon surrounds the covenant. This starts to make a lot more sense of each one of these, because you can start to understand, especially where we have challenges, is the Mosaic Covenant. A lot of times when you run into someone who is a militant atheist, they are just aggressively atheistic. They usually grew up in some form of Christianity, and they got no answers to the questions they were asking. They keep asking these questions about weird food laws and about really harsh judgments on certain laws and things about slavery and certain laws. And all of this starts to build this frustration of, why is it that no Christian seems to ever have an answer to these questions? And that's a really frustrating place to be. You can see some of this, for example, in The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, probably the world's most famous atheist. Richard Dawkins writes, and I can't quote it exactly, I didn't take time to memorize his horrible quote, but he says the character of God in the Old Testament is the most, and he lists off all these things. He's the most vile, hate-filled, spiteful, childish, abusive, power-hungry, malicious, and he lists out all these different things. It's a horrendous quote. But do we really have an answer for him in response? And it's been a struggle in the church since the early church. In the second hundreds AD, in the 200s AD, there was a man named Marcion. And Marcion started a following that taught this belief system that the God, the Father of Jesus, is not the God of the Old Testament. He divided the two up from each other because he said there's no way that God, the Father of Jesus, is this horrible character of God from the Old Testament. Now, that I don't agree with. I think he's mistaken, but he at least is facing the problem, and most of us just ignore the problem because it's a big problem. And we've been trying to deal with it for 2,000 or so years to understand what do you do with the God of the Old Testament in some of these passages and some of the ways that he responds to things. And there are others who, in the more modern times now, have been trying to change the scripture itself, saying, well, there are places that it says God, but I think it was actually Satan who was doing that, not God. And they can really weird ways to try to make that fit, but it doesn't fit. You have to rewrite vast portions of Scripture, and once you start doing that, all the reliability goes out the window. So what do you change? Where do you change it? Where do you stop changing it?